It was supposed to be a routine day, a day like any other for the flight attendant. She had done this job for years, welcoming passengers, helping them store their luggage, and ensuring that everyone had a smooth and comfortable journey. But today, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career, one that would not only cost her job but also leave her humiliated in a way she never imagined. The cabin doors had just opened, and passengers were making their way inside. Among them was a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She didn't wear designer labels that screamed wealth, nor did she flaunt expensive jewelry. Instead, she dressed in a way that was elegant yet understated. Someone successful, perhaps, but nothing that would make heads turn. But the flight attendant, conditioned by years of assumptions and stereotypes, took one look at her and decided she didn't belong. The woman approached the business class section, about to take her seat, when the flight attendant swiftly stepped in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but firm. "This section is reserved for business class passengers only." The woman stopped in her tracks. For a moment, she looked at the flight attendant with mild amusement, then replied calmly, "I know. I have a business class ticket." The flight attendant's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. Something about the woman's relaxed demeanor made her uneasy. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "May I see your ticket, please?" she asked, holding out her hand. The woman nodded and reached into her handbag. She retrieved a neatly folded ticket and handed it over. The flight attendant scanned it quickly, and her stomach tightened. It was indeed a business class ticket, but instead of admitting her mistake, she found herself questioning it. Had this woman somehow obtained a fake ticket? Was there a mix-up? She had seen people try to sneak into business class before, and something about this woman, her calmness, her confidence, rubbed her the wrong way. "I'm sorry," the flight attendant said, forcing a polite smile. "I just need to verify this with the system. Please wait here for a moment." The woman simply nodded, unfazed, and stepped aside. As the flight attendant disappeared into the crew area, a few other passengers took their seats, barely noticing the exchange. To them, it was just another pre-flight delay, nothing out of the ordinary. But for the woman, this was not just another misunderstanding. She knew exactly why this was happening, and she had a feeling things were about to escalate. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, her expression slightly hardened. She held the ticket in her hand, as if it was proof of something sinister. "I'm going to need you to come with me," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. At this, the woman raised an eyebrow. "Why?" she asked, her tone still composed. "We need to verify some details," the flight attendant replied, clearly growing impatient. "Please follow me." By now, a few passengers had begun to glance over, sensing the tension in the air. But the woman didn't move. She simply looked at the flight attendant, as if waiting for something. The flight attendant's patience snapped. She stepped closer, reaching out, and placed a firm hand on the woman's arm. "You need to come with me now," she said, her voice now bordering on aggressive. And that was the moment everything changed. The instant her hand touched the woman's arm, the atmosphere inside the plane shifted. A heavy silence fell over the cabin as nearby passengers turned to watch. The woman slowly looked down at the flight attendant's hand, then back up at her face. A chilling realization crept into the flight attendant's mind. Something was very wrong. She had assumed this woman was just another passenger, someone trying to sneak into business class. But what she failed to realize was that this woman was not just a passenger. She was the owner of the entire aircraft. And in the next few moments, she was going to let the flight attendant know exactly who she had just disrespected. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The flight attendant stood there, her hand still resting on the woman's arm, completely unaware that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The woman remained calm, but her eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto the flight attendant with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Passengers nearby sensed the shift in energy. The casual chatter that had filled the cabin just moments ago faded into silence as curious eyes turned toward the confrontation. Some assumed it was just another case of a passenger being in the wrong seat, while others could already tell that something much bigger was unfolding. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the woman lifted the flight attendant's hand off her arm and took a step forward. "Let go," she said, her voice quiet but commanding. The flight attendant hesitated. She had been trained to handle difficult passengers, but this was different. There was no shouting, no resistance, just an unsettling calm that made her uneasy. And yet, her ego refused to let her back down. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." "Now," she said again, her voice firm but now carrying a hint of uncertainty. The woman didn't move. Instead, she reached into her handbag and pulled out something that made the color drain from the flight attendant's face. A sleek, black metal card, embossed with a logo that only a select few in the world would recognize. A few rows back, a businessman who had been quietly observing the situation let out an audible gasp. His eyes widened as he recognized the card instantly. "No way," he muttered under his breath. Another passenger leaned toward him. What is it?" "That's a private ownership card," the businessman whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "It means she doesn't just fly on this airline. She owns it." The realization rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Heads turned. Conversations halted. Even the flight crew members, who had been busy preparing for takeoff, began to notice the unfolding spectacle. The flight attendant, however, still didn't get it. She looked at the card but failed to understand its significance. "What is this?" she asked, her frustration evident. The woman exhaled, clearly unamused. "It's the card that proves I own this plane." A nervous laugh escaped the flight attendant's lips. "That's impossible." The woman's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Is it?" Before the flight attendant could respond, the aircraft's captain stepped out of the cockpit, alerted by the murmurs spreading through the cabin. His sharp gaze landed on the woman, and the second he recognized her, his expression completely changed. "Madam, I didn't realize you were on this flight," he said, his voice suddenly laced with urgency and respect. The moment the captain spoke, the flight attendant felt her stomach drop. She turned to look at him, confusion written all over her face. You know her?" she asked hesitantly. The captain shot her a look that made it clear she had just crossed a very dangerous line. "Know her?" he repeated. "She's not just any passenger. She's the majority shareholder of this airline, which means she's technically your boss." Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. The flight attendant's throat went dry. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She felt like the floor had just disappeared beneath her feet. The woman, still calm, finally spoke again. "Now, do you still want me to leave my seat?" The flight attendant opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her entire world was crashing down around her. Every decision she had made in the past 5 minutes had led her to this exact moment, a moment she couldn't take back. Passengers around her were now whispering amongst themselves, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the unfolding drama. The woman took a step closer. "You made an assumption about me the second you saw me," she said, her voice steady. "And instead of correcting yourself, you doubled down. You let your bias control your judgment. And now, here we are." The flight attendant's hands trembled. She had worked for this airline for years, built a solid reputation, and prided herself on her professionalism. But in the span of 5 minutes, she had managed to destroy everything. The captain cleared his throat. "I think you owe our owner an apology." The flight attendant swallowed hard, her pride warring with the sinking realization that she had no other choice. Her voice came out weak, barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry." The woman didn't react. She simply stared at her, waiting. The flight attendant knew that wasn't enough. She needed to fix this. But could she? Or was it already too late? As the weight of her actions settled on her shoulders, she realized one thing. This flight was going to be the longest of her life. The weight of silence in the cabin was suffocating. The flight attendant stood frozen, her hands trembling as she realized the severity of her mistake. She had assumed this woman was just another passenger, someone she could intimidate into submission. But now, as she faced the reality that she had disrespected the owner of the very airline she worked for, her world was crashing down. Passengers murmured amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering about what might happen next. The businessman who had recognized the private ownership card earlier leaned over to his seatmate. "She's done for," he muttered. "You don't just insult a billionaire and walk away unscathed." The flight attendant's chest tightened. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to speak. I didn't know, she stammered, looking at the woman with desperate eyes. I had no idea who you were. The woman remained composed, her expression unreadable. And if I weren't the owner? If I were just another passenger, one without power or status, would you have treated me the same way? The flight attendant opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to deny it, to claim she treated everyone fairly, but she knew that would be a lie. She had judged this woman the moment she saw her. She had assumed things about her, and she had acted on those assumptions. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for an answer. When none came, she exhaled. That's what I thought. The captain cleared his throat, stepping forward. Madam, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding, he said, his tone dripping with nervousness. This is not how we train our staff to treat passengers, especially our most valued ones. The woman finally shifted her gaze to the captain. And yet, here we are, she replied, her voice even. The flight attendant felt her knees go weak. Please, she blurted out. Please, I didn't mean any harm. I was just assuming, the woman interrupted, her eyes narrowing. Just deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Just making a judgment based on nothing but your own bias. The flight attendant's face burned with shame. She could feel the eyes of the entire cabin on her, judging her the way she had judged the woman. The woman sighed, glancing down at her watch. I don't have time for this. She turned to the captain. What's your policy for employees who disrespect passengers? The captain hesitated, glancing at the flight attendant. Normally, such behavior would result in immediate disciplinary action, he admitted. The woman raised an eyebrow. And if the passenger happens to own the airline? The flight attendant's stomach dropped. The captain hesitated again. Then, I believe it would be up to you, madam, to decide what happens next. A wave of nausea hit the flight attendant. She had never been so afraid in her life. Losing her job wasn't just about financial security. It was about everything she had worked for. The years she had dedicated to this career, the sacrifices she had made. All of it was now in jeopardy because of a single mistake. She looked at the woman, desperation in her eyes. Please, she whispered. I need this job. I'll do anything to make it right. For the first time, the woman actually considered her. She studied the flight attendant's face, the panic in her eyes, the trembling in her hands. There was no arrogance left, only fear. She let the silence stretch for a moment longer before speaking. You want to make this right? The flight attendant nodded frantically. Yes, please. I'll do anything. The woman held her gaze for a long moment, then finally said, Then learn from this. The flight attendant blinked. What? You made a mistake, the woman continued. A big one. And I could fire you for it right now. But what would that accomplish? You'd lose your job, maybe find another, and eventually forget this moment. But if I let you stay, if I make sure you have to live with this mistake, you'll remember it every time you step onto a plane. The flight attendant's breath hitched. So, you're not firing me? The woman's eyes gleamed. Not yet. The flight attendant felt lightheaded with relief. But that relief was short-lived. I expect an apology, the woman said. Not just to me, but to this entire cabin. Every passenger here saw what you did. They saw you try to humiliate me. Now, I want them to see you take responsibility for it. The flight attendant's stomach twisted. Apologizing in front of the entire cabin? She could already feel the humiliation creeping up her spine. But what choice did she have? Swallowing her pride, she turned to face the passengers. Her voice shook as she spoke. I want to apologize, she said, barely above a whisper. I made a mistake. I judged someone unfairly, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I was wrong. Murmurs filled the cabin. Some passengers nodded approvingly. Others still looked unimpressed. But one thing was certain. No one would forget this moment. The woman watched her carefully, then nodded. That's a start. The flight attendant let out a shaky breath. But before she could feel any relief, the woman added, and one more thing. The flight attendant tensed. Yes? The woman's lips curled into a smirk. You'll be serving me personally for this entire flight? The flight attendant's stomach dropped again. Passengers around them chuckled, some outright laughing at the irony of the situation. The woman leaned in slightly, her voice a quiet whisper. Consider it a lesson in humility. And with that, she turned and took her seat, the seat she had owned from the very beginning. The flight attendant felt like she was walking through a dream, a nightmare, to be exact. The weight of humiliation sat heavy on her chest as she moved through the aisle, avoiding the amused glances of passengers. Every step felt like a reminder of her mistake, of the judgment she had so carelessly passed, and of the lesson she was now forced to learn in the most public way possible. She reached the woman's seat, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted her uniform. "Madam," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I get you anything?" The woman, now seated comfortably, looked up at her with an expression unreadable. She seemed perfectly at ease, as if she hadn't just flipped the flight attendant's entire world upside down. "A glass of water," she said simply. The flight attendant nodded quickly and turned, eager to get away even if just for a moment. She could feel the eyes of the passengers burning into her back as she hurried to the galley, grabbed a glass, and filled it with ice-cold water. As she returned, she was extra careful. No mistakes, no spills. She placed the glass gently on the tray in front of the woman. "Anything else, madam?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. The woman took a slow sip of water before setting the glass down. She then lifted her gaze, locking eyes with the flight attendant. "Tell me something," she said. "How long have you worked for this airline?" The question caught the flight attendant off guard. 6 years, she answered immediately. The woman nodded as if considering something. "And in those 6 years, how many passengers have you treated the way you treated me today?" The flight attendant felt the air leave her lungs. She wanted to say none. She wanted to insist that this was a one-time mistake, a lapse in judgment. But the truth sat like a weight on her shoulders. She had done this before. Not to someone powerful, not to someone who owned the airline, but to others, passengers she had assumed weren't important, people she had dismissed based on nothing but a glance. The realization settled in her chest like a rock. The woman didn't press her for an answer. She simply took another sip of water and let the silence stretch between them. The flight attendant lowered her gaze. I've made mistakes," she admitted, her voice small. The woman nodded slowly. "We all have." For the first time since the confrontation began, the flight attendant saw something in the woman's eyes she hadn't expected, understanding. The woman leaned back in her seat, studying her. "You don't need to impress me," she said finally. "You don't need to grovel or apologize 100 times. What you need to do is change." The words hit harder than the flight attendant had anticipated. She had been so consumed by fear. Fear of losing her job, fear of public humiliation, fear of consequences, that she hadn't stopped to think about what this moment was truly about. It wasn't just punishment. It was a wake-up call. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and nodded. "I understand." The woman studied her for another moment before giving a small nod. "Good." Then, just like that, the power shifted again. The flight attendant wasn't just an employee anymore. She wasn't just someone who had made a mistake. She was someone standing at a crossroads, given an opportunity that most people never got, a chance to see herself for who she truly was and decide who she wanted to be. As she turned to walk away, she felt different. Not defeated, but changed. The plane hummed steadily as it cruised through the sky, but inside, an unusual calm had settled. The tension that once gripped the cabin had loosened, though its echoes remained in the exchanged glances and hushed conversations of the passengers. The flight attendant moved through the aisle with a newfound awareness, feeling the weight of every step. She had spent years walking these same paths between seats, but for the first time, she truly saw the people around her. Each passenger had a story, a life beyond the confines of this plane, and she had been blind to that for so long. She returned to the front of the cabin, where the senior crew members stood whispering nervously. They had seen everything unfold, and though none of them had stepped in, their expressions were unreadable. The captain himself had been silent since his brief apology, and now he simply observed, waiting for what would come next. The woman who had upended the flight attendant's world remained relaxed in her seat. She scrolled through her phone with casual ease, as if she hadn't just taught a lesson no training manual could ever provide. But the flight attendant knew she was watching. Maybe not with her eyes, but with a quiet awareness that saw deeper than most. Finally, she took a breath and approached again. "Madam," she said carefully, standing before the billionaire. The woman looked up, arching a brow slightly. The flight attendant hesitated, then spoke. "I want to thank you." A flicker of amusement passed over the woman's face. "For what?" "For not firing me," she admitted. "For making me see what I couldn't before." The woman tapped a manicured nail against her armrest. "And what is it you see now?" The flight attendant swallowed. "That respect isn't about who someone appears to be. It's about who they are. And that I've let my own judgments cloud that for far too long." For the first time since the ordeal began, a small, genuine smile touched the woman's lips. "Good." A silence stretched between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. Then, the woman spoke again. "You know, I didn't always have power. There was a time when people like you looked at me and saw nothing but a girl who didn't belong." The flight attendant's chest tightened. She could hear the truth in her words, the years of struggle behind them. "I learned early that respect isn't given freely," the woman continued. "It's demanded, taken, earned. But you," she gave a pointed look, "you have a choice. You don't have to learn the hard way like I did." The flight attendant nodded, feeling something shift inside her. The woman studied her for a long moment, then exhaled, leaning back into her seat. "You can go now," she said simply. The flight attendant took a step back, then turned and walked away, her mind buzzing. Passengers watched her as she passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet approval. Some smiled at her now, acknowledging her in a way they hadn't before. She wasn't sure if it was sympathy or respect, but it felt different. It felt real. By the time the flight touched down, the atmosphere had transformed. As the doors opened and passengers began to disembark, the woman stood up, gathering her belongings. The flight attendant found herself watching, waiting for something, though she wasn't sure what. The woman paused just before exiting. She turned back, meeting the flight attendant's gaze one last time. "I'll be watching," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Then, with the same grace and confidence she had carried from the start, she walked off the plane and disappeared into the terminal. The flight attendant stood there, breathless, knowing that this was more than just another passenger leaving. This was the day everything changed.